Good morning, guests. I'm Conchetta Tamanara, the Editorial Director for Politics, International Relations, and Area Studies, based in Philadelphia, here to introduce the keynote speaker, Liz Neely. Liz is the Executive Director of Story Collider. She spent a decade helping researchers understand and apply communications advice about public engagement. Her expertise includes the science of science comm, social media, and science journalism in the US and the UK. She built her teaching career at Compass, which originally stood for Communication Partnership for Science and the Sea. And she served as the Assistant Director of Science Outreach, training hundreds of scientists of all career stages. Her actual background is as a marine biologist. She earned practical experience in coral reef conservation in both Fiji and Papua New Guinea, and policy experience in international trade policy for deep sea corals. She studied, in particular, the evolution of color patterns in tropical reef fishes, and that grounding in sensory biology and communication theory influenced her to this very day. So without ado, I give you Liz Neely.
Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for having me. It's a joy to be here. What I hope to do in the next half hour is to talk to you about storytelling, to delight, provoke, and in many ways, this is similar to what we do in our live shows. So the Story Collider, we think of ourselves as a theater company, in fact. We produce true personal stories about science. And these are not for children, which is one of the misconceptions as soon as you say storytelling, but rather for adults. We host more than 40 shows a year all over the US, mostly in bars and nightclubs, music venues. And it's not a TED-style talk. There are no lectures, no slides, for as much as I love keynote and PowerPoint, but just 5 individuals taking the stage, one by one, for a 10-minute story about science. And sometimes people say to us, what does that even mean? Am I going to hear like research findings? And yes, indeed, sometimes we do have those kinds of talks. But more it's about the ups and downs of the daily life, what it means to be a professional in this space. What is science? How do we do it? And so in these shows, we record all of the stories, and then every Friday release a new episode. Story Collider is available on iTunes and Stitcher, on the NPR One app, wherever you like your podcasts. And every week, this is the opening musical bit for the podcast.
A science story, huh?
Is that what the scientists say?
Right.
And I just thought, well, it was that golden moment.
Because science was on my side.
When you have headphones in particular, it's really lovely because it sounds like the voices are swirling around you. And this kind of vox populi opening is deliberate on our part. We like the idea of many different voices interleaving together, giving you an impression of the many diverse people and experiences of creating science and having it impact our lives. Now, I mentioned before that Story Collider considers ourselves to be a theater nonprofit, a performing arts group that happens to focus on science. For me, this is a strange experience because, as you heard before, I'm a marine biologist. So when I stand on stage next to my artistic director, this is Erin Barker. She's the first woman who ever won the Moth Grand Slam Championship twice. It's a slightly surreal feeling. My whole team, most of them come from backgrounds in stand-up comedy or improv, and then many of us have hard science backgrounds too. As you heard, I'm a marine biologist, and this picture is a bit murky because some of the diving conditions in which I worked were also turbid and somewhat dark. I studied the evolution of color patterns and visual systems in tropical reef fish, like this wrasse. And I wasn't so much interested in what these beautiful creatures look like to human beings, but rather what do they look like to each other? Which meant that I had to take necessarily sort of a mathematically based, more model-driven approach to create a conception of what the world looked like to these species. And I loved it. I loved the field work, I loved the lab work, I loved being comfortable in this space. I hated people. I hated having to speak to people about my work. And when I was forced into that inevitable elevator speech that you make your graduate students do, I cringed to remember I actually would say out loud, what do? Oh, I study the synonymous to non-synonymous substitution ratios in the transmembrane regions of rhodopsins and the retinas of Rhasis. And parrotfish. You're like, nailed it. I laugh now, and it's so easy to see that that kind of heavy jargon is no way to go about engaging anyone other than your immediate peers. But at the time, I wasn't so sure, and it took me a while to get used to this idea of communicating in a very different way to get these ideas across. Really, what I was interested in was how do fish, and now it's broadened into this bigger metaphor for communication in general, how do all of us take raw information that is flooding into our sensory systems and process it so that we can discern important signals in our environment? And when I think about my fish, since I have the clicker, I get to continue showing you pictures of these. We can look at two species of, these are lemon damselfish, pomacentrids. And if I asked you to tell me, how would we identify and distinguish between these two species? Most people looking at this might talk about a dark spot on the pectoral fin of that top fish, or maybe that their eyes are a little bit different. But again, we're forgetting that we're human beings looking at these things with human eyes. And in fact, these fish have access to information wavelengths that we don't. So in the UV, these fish have different patterns on their faces that are remarkable and distinct. And this idea that even as we struggle to separate signal from noise, we may often not have access to, not understand what is in fact signal and the things that look like noise to us. This idea is called Umwelt. It was the most powerful thing I learned in graduate school, a way of looking at the world and understanding that every species has a unique combination of our sensory inputs as well as all of the higher level cognitive processing that shapes how we experience the world. And I think this is a beautiful way to think about how do we disperse information from within specialized circles into other kinds of communities who experience the world in a very different way. Now, as I progressed through grad school and even into science communication, I really was on board with this idea of science literacy and numeracy, teaching people how to read graphs, teaching people how to best translate our science communication. But storytelling, I did not like that idea. Because to me, it was childish, right? Or worse, it was like in science, it's a bit about hand waving. Like when your data's not strong enough, you tell a wonderful story to kind of like nudge people towards the interpretation that you prefer. So I really wanted nothing to do with that. But not every story begins with once upon a time. One of my favorite quotes recently from a fictional author, Liu Xinxin, who wrote The Three-Body Problem, is that science is full of the most magnificent and strange stories, far more vast than anything we can find in literature. Only our stories are most frequently encoded in cold equations that most people do not know how to read. This equation, some of you might actually recognize it, is the Rescorla-Wagner equation. It's about conditioned learning. And the beautiful story encoded in this cold equation is the idea that learning, in fact, happens, we can chunk this out, learning happens when what you expect of the world is a mismatch with what actually happens. It's the aha moment when you thought you understood how things worked, and then you have a piece of information that contradicts it. We learn. Mediated, of course, by the salience of the stimulus plus your learning speed. I really like this idea, though, that human beings are driven by a need to predict what's going to happen next, that we build models of how things, including other people, work. And we need to understand how other people work because in addition to the predators that threatened us early in our evolution, other human beings are a severe danger. So we need to understand their motivations and what they might be doing. And this drive to be able to understand human beings, their motivations, how they see the world, and what they are going to do, perhaps to us, is so ingrained that you even see something as simple as all human beings are constantly constructing narratives. And so most neurotypical children and adults, you just show them simple shapes like this. and this is research going all the way back to the 1940s, and particularly if you animate those shapes, we almost cannot help but start to attribute meaning here and emotion, the poor little blue dot being menaced by, those triangles. We laugh. Sometimes we think of stories as a shortcut that short circuits our higher level logic or reasoning, and I just don't think that that's true at all. Rather, stories are a mechanism that we as a species have evolved. It's a powerful way that we package information about who we are, how our world works, what we care about, and how we survive, and then distribute that over space and time. Stories have a resonance and a meaning, a stickiness, a pleasurability to them that no amount of data does. And I think if it's not enough for you to look at the campfire and think about us gathering around telling stories, that's okay. Because the National Academies agrees with me. So right now, there's a lot of scholarly effort going into revisit our ideas of what science literacy looks like. Rather than being able to regurgitate an arbitrary body of facts, we understand science literacy to be a challenge of understanding what is the culture of science, the human processes, what is the scientific method. And so between this, invitations like the one that I've received today, the long-standing partnership that Story Collider has with the Springer Nature Storytellers series, or the upcoming white paper that Wiley will be releasing next year about science literacy, we know that collectively we are struggling with the idea of how do we disseminate ideas. And so my first argument for you is that stories are powerful. They are how we construct and break and test models of the world, and that they are an excellent starting place for getting beyond some of the limitations of traditional science communication to get these ideas out of our journals, out of the ivory tower, and into the world. For me, I needed the legitimacy of peer-reviewed research to understand the power of narratives. And so at a very high level, sort of my best approximation of all that reading and synthesis that I've done is that stories are prioritized in our very human brains, and they are more interesting, so people want to pay attention to them in the first place, and to continue engaging and listening with them. They are more comprehensible, so people take away, are able to process and understand and recall information packaged in a story structure as compared to other forms of argumentation or evidence-based communications. And perhaps most importantly for those of us who are working in fields where public apathy or perhaps opposition is quite high, stories are both more believable and more persuasive to skeptical audiences. So we know that this particular form of narrative underpins many of our science communication goals. And I think the challenge is that oftentimes when I give these talks, inevitably someone will come up after me and say, well, the plural of anecdote is not data. As if we haven't thought about that. As if we don't have entire bodies of literature analyzing what exactly stories are, how they work, and the ethics of using these specifically for science communication. The argument that I make every time I take a stage is that I hope that we as a community of scientists, science publishers, those who care about getting these data-driven approaches out into the world can be as careful, as rigorous, and as empirically driven in our science communication as we are in the science we hope to communicate in the first place. And stories have a body and a wealth of information behind them. Some of the things that I think are important when we make this distinction between sharing the facts in science communication versus science storytelling and the style that Story Collider pursues, one is about generalizability. So science communication is making a broad, abstract claim about the way the world works. We can test it, and then we can drive down to specifics using logic, sort of that deductive logic. Storytelling, on the other hand, is exactly opposite of that, right? We take a small personal case study and we generalize outwards from that inductive reasoning. There's also a great degree of variation in how much stories versus science communication rely on context, as well as the sources of legitimacy and validity You know, you would never go in front of a jury if a judge asked you a question, and rather than answering the question, say, well, let me tell you a story. You know, it's not the correct thing in all times and all places, but just because stories are held to different standards of truth does not mean that we cannot trust them. Stories are judged on their verisimilitude. Do they feel real and plausible? And I think about this very specifically to the complex ways. So Leon showed us fun diagrams of the many overlapping factors of how information is percolating through systems through the publication process. When we think about how those ideas are competing in a public marketplace of ideas, you have to add on top of that all of the media coverage, all of the competing desires to twist narratives and to make meaning out of challenging or ambiguous science findings. If I say power poses, how many of you in the room are familiar with that idea? How many of you have strong feelings about whether they work or not? Right? This is, I think, one of the most fascinating examples of an instance in which a scientific finding achieves great public traction. Amy Cuddy's talk is the second most viewed TED-style talk ever. And then we start to see co-authors and critics arguing, rejecting some of the elements of the science, both, and not all of this is mediated through the peer-reviewed process. In fact, much of it is not. For those of us who are struggling to make sense of, is this a finding I can pay attention to? Do I trust it? We may do things like read this long piece that came out in the New York Times Magazine in the middle of last week. We might also do something like find the way that we interpret this continues to shift as we learn more and more backstory about both the publication itself as well as Dr. Cuddy as a researcher. She told a story for the Story Collider. I had not known until I listened to that tape that she suffered a brain injury when she was in college. And here is how she describes a moment that was important for her during her recovery.
The craziness of head injury, part of it is that I don't know, because I can't remember. You know, I just don't know what I was like before. I only know what I am like now. I don't know how I ended up at Harvard. It was never on the radar for me, ever. And I ended up at Harvard studying how people can become their aspirational selves. Like, how can you become a self that you're not now?
I think you can hear the emotion in her voice there. And in fact, during the story, her voice cracks and she cries a little bit. And she talks about this divorce she had between her past self before the injury and who she had become and who she would go on to become. That context was interesting for me. It's not that the emotion in it swayed me to think differently about the results specifically on the hormonal findings that are at the heart of the controversy around this paper. But this kind of meta-narrative, the ways in which her critics in the blogs, Dr. Cuddy herself and her proxies, as well as journalists are covering it and attempting to make sense of a complex situation, certainly influences the way that I think about how we teach narrative skills to scientists in our workshops. In my early days, I was really drawn to sort of like the brain imaging approach of what does a human brain look like if we put it in an MRI or an fMRI, and we ask questions about, does listening to a story do something to us? What are the neural substrates for communication? And I get excited about things like speaker-listener neural coupling, the ways in which if I'm using evocative sensory language about the gooey chocolate chip cookie I had last night, your brains might be lighting up in a similar way. But I also know that I know enough about replication challenges and the limitations of my ability to interpret these kinds of science that I don't lean on that in quite the same way that I would have perhaps 2 or 3 years ago. In fact, now I'm paying a lot more of attention, not what happens inside human brains, but we know that attention and engagement are embodied processes. When you're speaking and your audience is bored, all of us unfortunately know what that feels like. We know what it looks like. People yawn, they're kind of looking off into space, they fidget, they're on their phones perhaps. But we also know what it looks like when an audience is just rapt. And some of the work that delights me the most at the moment has to do with audiences And human beings, because we evolved as a visual species, we tend to keep our eyes wide open during moments of uncertainty while we're searching for information. And then when things have been resolved or there's a moment of resolution, we blink. And in fact, masterful storytellers or films can induce statistically significant synchronized eye blinking rates among audiences, which I think it's beautiful and strange. You can't see it, so don't waste your time the next time you're on stage looking out to see. But this also ties directly into whether people are really raptly engaged in the story. And when I dig into the literature, what we understand is that feeling of being swept into a story world, we all know what that is like, right? It's like you're reading a book, you can't hear someone call your name. Or you're in a movie theater and 2 hours have just passed and you can't believe it. That is called transportation. And that is a particular goal for those persuasive moments when we're trying to convince an audience to change their mind. And so those of us who, like me, are not born performers, but rather academics or intellectuals who need to think our way through understanding communication, we can start digging here. So transportation is a mind state. What enhances it? We know that there are two things, intensive processing and uncritical processing. Intensive processing, that is the difference between saying like, oh, that was a very sad story, versus the ugly crying where you start hiccuping and you can't stop, right? So it's independent of whether happy or sad or anything like that, just a strong emotional experience. And then uncritical processing does not mean a lack of logic or that we are short-circuiting people's higher brains. Rather, it means that the story has strong internal cohesion, and so that people are not counter-arguing with the story world as it's being developed. So if you say like a 4-year-old says something, that it actually sounds like something a 4-year-old would say. We know that this triad varies from individual to individual. We know there are gender differences. Some of us have a very strong need for cognition, others have a strong need for affect. We know that reading strategies and previous knowledge, all of this goes into whether or not someone is likely to be transported or not. But if we are looking to create these experiences to achieve some sort of science communication outcome, we can continue asking questions about what enables intensive and uncritical processing. These narrativity factors, this is where we are getting into the science of science communication, the science of performance. And I love it. My artistic director hates this slide. She hates that I show it because it's so complex. And you can read, you could read all of this. You could read all of the papers underpinning it. You could spend all the time in the citation and in the literature that you want. But this wouldn't actually help you stand up on stage and tell an amazing story. And part of the reason is because this is that disconnect. We believe that science and art are equally important and that they do different things. And the science can tell us about, how affective structure influences the experience of suspense. But affective structure, really what we're talking about is feelings, And so helping to bridge this divide between that sort of high-level, abstract, intellectual thought versus the kinds of things that people get excited about listening to when you're on stage, rather than bored. That's the work of the Story Collider. We do all sorts of stuff. We talk about films. We use these characters from Pixar's Inside Out as a starting place, actually based on reasonably good neuroscience on human emotion. And we also back it up with pragmatic examples of, if you want to understand what makes online content spread, we know emotion has an important piece there. We can continue digging into this and look at all of these models and the ways in which strong emotionality and personal experience predict an audience's willingness to do a repeat viewing, to visit a piece of content again and again, to talk to other people about it. But none of that will make as big of an impact on you as the story of when I sat down at a wedding rehearsal dinner and ordered. And the groomsman sitting next to me, his head snapped like a snake and he stuck his finger in my face and he said, "I had you pegged as a vegetarian the second you walked in here." And he wanted to talk about climate change and he wanted to talk about evolution. And it's a wedding. So I cannot argue and fight with him. And I also was unprepared. I didn't have like the facts and figures at my fingertips. So I found out he was a Marine. I thanked him for his service. My dad's military. I talked to him about the way my father and I have argued about climate change over the years. And by the end of the night, thanks alcohol, I'm sure. But by the end of the night, he hugged me and he had some tears in his eyes and he said, no one has ever talked to me about this stuff before without yelling at me and telling me I'm stupid. This idea that we can share science and connect on a human level, and that even this incredible, tough Marine had hurt little feelings, and he was afraid that I would think he was stupid or yell at him. This shapes my model of science communication and the power of individual human stories, particularly the people who are doing this incredible work to get out there into the world. I want to wrap up by saying, when we think about storytelling and narrative structure, we almost are always phrasing this as like an outward-facing public communication goal. But the truth is, all humans respond to these structures, and it's not necessarily a strong emotional appeal that makes something powerful or not. This paper is the beginning of a body of work looking at the abstracts of publications on specifically to climate change in this instance, but that even when you control for as much as we possibly can control for, abstracts written with a more narrative quality to them tend to be more highly cited. So, when we think about stories, what are they? We think about the fact that they have two crucial components: characters and causality. Characters being, in our instance, scientists, individuals, and then causality are the things that are happening to them, the choices that they make as a consequence, the actions that they take, and then more things happening. And that it's the link between those that is so important. Just want to pause for a time check. How much more time do I have? 7 minutes. Excellent. And so we know this structure so well because we hear it in fairy tales, right? This idea of causal linkages is embedded in our language. Once upon a time, the world was this way, and every day the world was the same. Until one day, something changes. Because of that, until one day, finally, we have, the epic conclusion, and ever since then, the world has been different. Now, this is a convention specific to that form of storytelling. We have conventions in all the genres we look at. So, for example, big budget Hollywood movies. This is a famous script writing book, Save the Cat. He has 15 so-called story beats that must happen. And in parentheses, those are the page numbers on the script in which the executives expect this to happen, right? I love this because some of it really makes sense, like all is lost in the dark night of the soul, right? But other things like the break into two are a bit more opaque. The reason that we put this up is to show that there is an expectation and a timing of what needs to happen in order to keep audiences engaged in this format. Now, when we think about how we experience this in the real world, in our workshops, we show scientists the 3-act structure. We ask them to become critical observers of the stories that are flooding into their lives every day. And again, we can use that fairy tale structure. Once upon a time, the world was this way, until one day something happens that sets things in motion. At some point, we know the world will never be the same, and our hero sets off on a journey. In Act 2, this is confrontation. Usually we cannot resolve our problems here because we don't have the right life skills, or perhaps we haven't built the right team. And then this is the all is lost moment in this particular structure. And then Act 3 is the resolution, right? We can take these same colors and map them back onto that beat sheet. And when you do that, and then also encode those little markers of indicating what's happening, this helps give a sense of the timing again. and how audiences are reacting to the construction of these story worlds. If I had understood this before I told my first story on the Story Collider stage, I probably wouldn't have talked about oysters for 7 minutes where nothing happened yet. So this is formulaic, of course, but it's big money formulas, and it's rewarding. Another genre that we can look to is fiction. Kurt Vonnegut talks about this idea that it's not only the characters and the causality, but the consequences. What are the stakes? What are the emotions at play? So if at the top we have great good fortune and at the bottom we have ill fortune, your story must move up and down, or else it's boring. And the best part about this is our best available science, chunking 40,000 works of literature in the English language through big data analysis, looking at that emotional quality, shows us that yes, indeed, 6 major shapes fall out, and they're familiar to us, right? Rags to riches, yay. Tragedies, woman in a hole where everything's fine, I struggle, and then because of my gumption, I get out again. Stories of flying too close to the sun. Maybe that's greed or a lack of humility. We love poetic justice, and as we go on. The nice thing when we talk to scientists, when we teach this, is that we can simplify all of that. You can geek out about story structure. I would love to talk over coffee with anybody who likes that. But we have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and in the middle, something changes. So when we think about why are we doing all of this, why stories, you'll notice I don't have education as one of my explicit goals. I often find that the scientists I work with have a mental model where they think like, oh, we'll tell a story to like get people excited and then we'll stealth educate them. Like, let's not do that. Your science is not broccoli we need to somehow like force feed or trick someone into liking. We tell stories and we listen to stories. We should create space for them for many reasons. One is to give voice to experience of what we have seen, what we know of this world. Another, and this is incredibly important, is to bear witness to suffering, because there are many instances in which the best of our science can do nothing to touch the real world problem facing someone tomorrow or 6 weeks from now. This also gives rise to this idea of the social legitimacy of science and sort of procedural fairness, the ways in which people feel like they're heard in spaces and valued, and then they will be willing to continue participating. We tell stories to construct identity. What makes a good grad student? What happens to a postdoc who only works 40 hours a week? There are all sorts of ways in which we inadvertently are reinforcing social norms in our professions according to the kinds of stories that we tell. And then finally, we use stories to connect knowledge to action. And sometimes we know that it takes a whole lot of stories to give credence to support the overwhelming evidence that currently exists for kinds of problems that we face. So I'm going to close this out by asking the question of why do we tell stories? We tell stories in order to ask this question, answer the question of what is normal. Some of the most classic examples are school children, when asked to draw a scientist, will draw old white men in lab coats, bald with glasses, doing dangerous things. But after they meet nuclear engineers and physicists and scientists, they draw people of color, they draw men and women, and they also write paragraphs that say things like, I didn't know you could be a scientist and love ping pong like I do. And it's not just children. Some of my greatest moments of pride as the executive director of Story Collider is starting to see the ways in which our episodes of our podcast are making a difference in the lives of undergraduate students and reducing stereotype threat and allowing them to envision futures for themselves in science. When I look at the scientists who take our stage and share their heartbreak and the hilarity and the insults and the assaults of science, I think about the bravery and the sort of the intellectual prowess and the incredible humanity of science and the people who do it. We know that when you have a big shiny tool, a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail, right? But hammers can build houses just as easily as they can break kneecaps. And so when we think about manipulation versus persuasion, and whether it's legitimate to use stories, I certainly think these are valid questions worth asking in an open way. I will spare you a story that I had about the sophists, this school of thought in ancient Greek. Their own name has turned into an insult, sophistry, but the root word is wisdom, sophi, like sophisticated. And this idea that we need to give careful thought to the content of what we are sharing, in addition to the beauty and sort of mastery of presenting it well, is important. And it goes towards this idea that our science communication is not only about our competence and the quality of our data, but also the goodwill and trustworthiness of the scientific enterprise in understanding people's lives and helping to make difficult social decisions. I know that all of you in the publishing business are dealing with this idea of products, pushing stuff out into the world. Stories are powerful products. They are also incredibly valuable processes by which we collectively resolve ambiguity, struggle with meaning, and create our understanding of the world. When you are looking at a space where you feel like you're subject to the tyranny of the like, I know this can be overwhelming. How many page views? How many people? I go back to where I started in animal behavior, and I realize, to me, this looks like a school of fish or a flock of birds. And nobody ever asks whether birds are good or bad because they fly in flocks. We marvel at the beauty of these murmurations as they move across the sky. And if we're so inclined, we can study them and ask questions about how individuals determine their behavior, how they react to their nearest neighbors, and how these incredible swirling motions happen. I think stories are how human beings fly in flocks. I hope that you, your authors, everyone you come into contact with, understands that we are all full of incredible stories about science. We hope that you tell them, and we hope that you tell them well. Thank you very much.